Okay, hello. This is recording. Yeah. Um, cool. So right now I just got off the first call of a four-part series reading group on this paper, which I'll pull up in a second. I'll show it here actually, by Eugene Gendlin called A Theory of Personality Change. It's actually a book chapter which he wrote and published in 1964. So I learned today in the group that he wrote this like in his early to mid 30s. Um, and I, yeah, anyway, so for context, a few months ago at this point, I finished a long term project of reading through all of Eugene Gendlin's public archive from the first available paper in 1955, all going all the way until I believe 2017. So basically 7 decades, more or less, of papers. There's about 150, and it was awesome experience to work my way through that chronologically. But uh, I I I kind of read my way through it in a sense, because I've been using Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book process. So I sort of did a superficial reading on this first round, but always with the intention of coming back and going deeper and doing more analytical readings. So I was super excited to discover a month or two ago that there was this reading group being hosted by Akira Ikemi, in which we were going to read, and he was going to lead a discussion on a theory of personality change. So, yeah, I just got off this call. It's 2 hours, and I wanted to, while it's still fresh, I have my notes here on the right side. And while it's still fresh on my mind, I just wanted to kind of go back through and reflect on the discussion and some of the questions that came up and some of the things that were shared that were interesting to me, and open questions that I have, and whatever, see where it goes. Just want to capture my reflections while it's still fresh. So here's Akira's bio there. I think it's kind of out of date on the left, but he was a student of Eugene Gendlin at the University of Chicago, which is pretty cool. So he was right there, kind of like as Gendlin was. He actually didn't say whether he was there at the same time. He said he was there in the 70s, so I don't know where Carl Rogers would have been at that point. There might have been, Carl Rogers might have moved on rather than being overlapped. Um, but yeah, so he was a student of Gendlin, and then again, I think this is dated, but professor of psychotherapy at Kansai University in Japan. Served on the International Focusing Institute boards. This is an interesting thing. I didn't look into it more. He was named Living Luminary by the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, and was awarded the prestigious Japanese Association for Humanistic Psychology Award. So, pretty like big. Like, I've run into him many times online when I'm looking for material on Gendlin. So, pretty serious student of Gendlin and major uh, psychological thinker and practitioner in his own right. So it was pretty cool to have this chance to read this paper directly with him. And so, yeah, it was interesting. He said, even though this paper was published in 1964, when Gendlin was very young, like I said, the first paper in the archive is from 1955, so only a decade into his publishing, really. And then there was 6 decades more of his thinking after that. But nonetheless, Akira said that um, he thinks that really this paper has it all in here. Like most of the key concepts that Gendlin, worked on for the rest of his career are in here. I, I know because I've read it all at this point that like not all of the concepts are in here in the same language, certainly not with the same degree of refinement, etc. But in broad strokes, kind of the big puzzle pieces are here. Um, so yeah, um, one second. Okay, so again, I have my notes here on the side. I guess I'm not gonna. I don't think it makes sense to just try to skim through the actual paper here. But, I'll just like look through my notes and try to speak to my notes and articulate what they were about. Okay, so this first one I have here is this was something that Akira said as he was mentioning that he was there in Chicago in the 70s. Uh, he, he was talking about like the importance of the title and why it's a theory of personality change specifically. And yeah, so he was pointing out that basically at that time in the 60s and 70s, I guess personality is sort of, he didn't say it this way, this is my articulation, but personality is sort of the concrete manifestation of like how a person is, you know. What are they like? What are their behavior patterns? What are their, the personality is sort of how a person's inner world manifests itself externally, right? And so insofar as psychotherapy is about not simply defining like with static snapshots of ways in which people are, it's about helping people change. There needed to be a theory of personality and what is personality and how does personality change, because that is the thing that is changing in therapy. In a successful therapy endeavor, a person's personality at the beginning when they come in is going to be different than it is at the end, like in broad strokes. Obviously, like you can dive in and say various particular things are different, but as a whole, the personality is different in some regard. So anyway, that this was sort of the reason why personality change needed a theory. He also makes a distinction about how at that time most theories of psychology and personality and psychotherapy, they didn't have a theory about the change aspect. There were lots of theories about what personality is and the way in which personality forms and develops, but there wasn't any real accounting for how that personality then changes. Um, all therapists recognize that personality does change, but the theories available at that time, for example, Freudian psychoanalysis, um, they don't really provide the conceptual frameworks to understand the actual process by which change occurs. You can say that somebody has an Oedipus complex and then at the end of therapy no longer has an Oedipus complex, but how exactly it happens that they dissolve that complex is not well accounted for in psychoanalytic theory. Um, there are attempts made to account for it, or to acknowledge that it does happen, but the concepts within the theory, as I'll say as we go on and as it's here in the paper, the concepts themselves kind of put the theory in I don't know, catch 22 or double bind, where the concepts make the change that we actually do see, the change that we actually do experience in people, the concepts that we have available make that change theoretically impossible. So I'll say more about that as we go along. I'm sure I have notes here. um, okay, so yeah, the next note here is that Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers was, working at University of Chicago. Gendlin was a professor of philosophy there. I don't know if actually he was a professor yet, but he was there working in phenomenology, and he linked up with Carl Rogers and became a colleague. But anyway, excuse me, Rogers published his own personality theory in 1959. I don't know specifically if that's a book or what. I have not yet dug really into Carl Rogers, but Akira said that this paper is somewhat of a critique of Rogers. So that's interesting. We didn't really get to saying anything about that in today's call. So I will be curious as we go on to hear more about that. Akira then said that this is Gene's phenomenological investigation of experience. So that's a really key thing. I don't think that in the section we read today, so it's just about a quarter of the paper, I don't think he even uses the word phenomena. He might say phenomena. He certainly doesn't talk about phenomenology, but it is something that we talked about in the discussion about the way in which Gendlin in this paper is using techniques from the phenomenological method. And it's really about looking directly at experience, concrete experience. What do we actually observe? And seeing the gaps, if you will, between what we actually observe and what theories account for. And then being like, okay, well, there's this gap here. We experience in clinical practice that change does occur, but the theories that we have don't allow us to explain that. And so what's going on there? Insofar as they don't explain what we actually do experience, it doesn't invalidate our observations. It means that our theory is not good enough, that we need to update our theory, refine it, reformulate things. Um, he mentioned that he thinks he was just reading these names at the beginning that Gendlin says he's grateful to. Um, so Kira was saying that he thinks that this paper is completely original and not deriving or building on other people's theory very much. Um, Next note is that theory includes defined terms and the relationship between these terms. Um, where my mind goes with this is I've recently been sort of looking more closely at the Qualia Research Institute website and specifically reading their whatever is called the Field Guide to Writing Trip Reports, I think, and then various links from that page. And I'm very curious about their work and their approach because they're deeply phenomenological, um, and yet they're phenomenological. I feel in a very different way. I mean, it's a group that is a lot of people with very technical backgrounds, a lot of people in tech, a lot of mathematicians, and even though it feels like what they're doing is so close to the type of work Gendlin was doing and the kind of work that I am doing in my own stuff. Um, Nonetheless, it feels like I can't grasp the way that they talk about things. Um, there's some, yeah, conceptual, theoretical gap uh, between the world that they exist in and the world of Gendlin that I've been occupying for so long now. And I don't know what to do with that. I need to keep reading their stuff to make sense of it. But specifically, one thing that came to mind is that as I was reading their various pages, the way in which they utilize theory, there's something about it that strikes me as, I don't know, odd or what, but as very different than what I've experienced in the way that Gendlin writes, and different also. Again, this might just be because I haven't read them closely enough, but different. It feels different than the way that Gendlin takes theory so seriously here. There's a sort of, yeah, when I've read the QRI pages, the way that they use theory or reference theory is they just sort of like, they'll say, like, according to this theory, so and so, and like, based on this theory, so and so, and then there's this here theory here, and they sort of just point to theory as um, it's not giving them nearly enough credit to say that they're just pointing to theory as a way to sort of back themselves up, but it feels insubstantial somehow. Mhm. And I guess a lot of the theories that they point to, I'm not familiar with as well, so I don't know if, those theories are super fleshed out, real, like, well developed conceptual systems or what, but I guess one way to put what I'm trying to get at here is that the way it occurred to me when I read their pages and the way that they reference these other theories, I just don't know if theory is like the actual term theory, the concept of a theory. I don't know if it's always used as like rigorously as Gendlin seems to do it. Um, yeah, I don't want to get too hung up on this point. this is for me to just think about as I continue reading their stuff. But hmm, yeah, like maybe what I'll just read here is right, a theory requires terms, defined words with which to specify observations, and a formulation of a chain of theoretical hypotheses. And then this last sentence. We can have a genuine theory only with carefully defined terms, and only by using defined terms can we later modify, improve, and extend theory. So I guess my question roughly is, do these theories that are being pointed to by the QRI folks, do they qualify in this, according to this way of talking about theory? I don't know. But this was not in my notes, but something I'll say is, this is something that I really appreciate about Gendlin. Crap, there's a smoothie being made. Hopefully it's not too... Uh, um, there's nothing I can do. Gendlin was a philosopher, and it's funny that he says it, right away in his most popular book, Focusing. He says that he's a philosopher. And somehow people kind of don't remember this, is my general impression. But he was a philosopher. His specialty was really phenomenology, also existential philosophy, and or also Aristotle. He wrote a line-by-line commentary on De Anima, and so Gendlin, as some background, he didn't start out in the field of psychology, but he comes together with Carl Rogers, and they start working together because he realized what Carl Rogers was doing in his clinical practice and research was effectively a direct application and a sort of laboratory of the exact kind of philosophical and phenomenological questions that Eugene was asking in his own work. And so Gendlin comes into the field of psychology, and because he has this philosophical way of looking at things, one of the things that he taught at University of Chicago was a course called theory construction. So he really thought seriously about how do theories work, how are they formed, how do they evolve, what do they allow us to do, and what does the lack of a good theory, what are the repercussions of that for the field in which that theory exists. And so he comes into psychology and he realizes, wow, here we are doing psychotherapy, the ultimate aim of which is to help people change and grow and improve themselves and live better lives and whatever. And we have all these theories, that exist right now. I keep mentioning Freud as the most popular, well-known one, and these theories say a lot about psychological states and fixed states. I mentioned Oedipus complex before, but what they don't account for is how change happens, which is ultimately what therapy is about. And so if we as therapists want to get better at what we do, if we want to help people more effectively, we need a way to really be able to think carefully about what we're doing, and then make hypotheses, as you can do in good science. um, make hypotheses about how things work, and make tests, and then see if those tests, affirm the theory, or if they reveal things which are unexplained by the theory, and then update the theory to account for those things which the hypotheses and tests reveal. And effectively, this wasn't possible within the field of therapy, because the concepts and theories that existed were built on concepts which made the possibility of change, or which made change between fixed states theoretically impossible. So he comes in and he does something in the field which I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for, which is to effective. It's a sort of meta type of analysis, or a meta contribution, of allowing the field as a whole to have a more cohesive, well-structured system of concepts that relate to each other, which are very precise, which allow us to think about how to do our work better, so that we're not just sort of bouncing between theories, even though those theories don't really line up with each other, and we don't get caught up in theories trying to explain, what we actually do experience in clinical practice, with theories and concepts which contradict the possibility of those very things that we're observing and experiencing. Because we can get very caught up stuck in a loop, going round and round, if we're like, well, this just happened. I just changed in this way. I'm having this kind of experience and feeling, or my client is. And yet, the way in which I am able to think about that, and explain it, sort of undercuts the very thing that I just experienced. So anyway, it's not a very good articulation, but I don't want to get hung up there. So yeah, okay. Akira mentions that the terms in this paper are still used in modern psychology. Okay, so I think this note was from Akira in response to a question that I asked. Okay, because I asked basically, is it the case that the lack of theory about change, was that a other theories? Why was it always focus on the fixed states of personality rather than how change occurs? And I guess, in many ways, I know this through my reading of Gendlin at this point, but what Akira said was, at that time, the primary model or paradigm that psychology was working on was a mechanistic model, what Gendlin later calls a unit model, which is, well, he uses this example of a watch, right? Which is like, if your watch breaks, a watch is made up of a bunch of parts, mechanical parts. So if your watch breaks, you want to figure out which part broke, and you want to understand something about how the watch was built and how the parts fit together so that it can function, so that you can analyze what has gone wrong and then fix that some way. But the parts in the watch and the watch itself we have no expectation that those things are themselves going to change. They are always fixed. A watch is a watch. It does what a watch does. The parts of a watch are what they are, but they don't change into something else. And this is the sort of paradigm that psychology, and more broadly than psychology, just sort of general culture, I even venture to say, that's the paradigm that was in place, was this mechanistic paradigm, and that's how we understood human beings as well. So a lot of the work in theory of psychology at that time was based in this paradigm, and therefore was concerned with the development of personality, not how does personality change, but how does personality come to be what it is at a certain point. How is personality built, so to speak, as if in a factory or something. So yeah, there was a large focus on how does personality develop, and what are the parts of personality, and what could be broken in personality, so that it can be fixed, but no real theoretical focus on the actual process of change because of that fundamental mechanistic paradigm. So then there's a note here. So it's not as if other theories don't acknowledge that change happens. They absolutely do. They see it every day in their clinical practices, but theoretically, they can't really account for it. Okay, so this is a question of mine. Out of context, it might not really make sense, but basically I'm asking, do the very concepts of contents and patterns, are concepts and patterns things which by their very nature do not change? Right? Because Gendlin's talking about, for example, most theories at this time thought of people as being kind of made up of psychological content, complexes, etc., or patterns, and that these contents kind of just remain as they are. They're sitting there, like the parts in a watch. And he says at a certain point, I don't know where it was. Here. So he says, we usually think of a person as involving identity and continuity through time. However, the contents and patterns in the theories are a type of explanatory concept which renders change impossible by definition. So he says the contents and patterns here. So I was wondering whether it's that certain kinds of contents and certain kinds of patterns lock you into this model in which no change is possible, or if it's that the very concept of contents and patterns themselves are essentially fixed, that contents never change. Patterns are a thing which, by definition, don't change. I don't know that we didn't have enough time to really unpack that, but that was a question I had. I think based on all my other reading, I would say that the answer is yes, that content and pattern are concepts which by their very nature, do not change. Gendlin does say over time in many, many places, that we can have new concepts which allow for change. So concepts can somehow allow for change, but content and pattern are not things which can allow for change. So that probably doesn't make sense to anyone, but that was a question I had. Then, so I have this bit as an example, which was from Akira. So this is about this sort of content paradigm of personality, right? When maybe you are in a session as a client or as the practitioner, and the client says, the whole time I was in that relationship, I was angry. This is what he says maybe at the beginning when they first start talking about it. And then over the course of the session, realizes, oh, it wasn't anger, but loneliness. And then says, oh, it's been true the whole time. All along, it's true that I was lonely, but I just wasn't aware that I was lonely. And so there's a big question there, like, what's happening there? Like, is it the case that the loneliness did really exist all along as loneliness? Like, the loneliness was there as a thing, just sort of tucked away and out of awareness? Or, are we in this session now, in the reflection period, are we reconceiving of what the experience was? Or it's not that there was loneliness underneath everything that we are just now recognizing, but that in reflection we sort of redefine and reconceive of what the experience was that we were having the whole time. So we thought we were angry, like it felt to us the whole way through that we were angry, but now in looking back, it seems to be something else, and we come to understand it in a different way. This is kind of hard to articulate. Like, does the process of reflecting and reconceiving and redefining, is that itself what changes it? So is it a discovery of something that was there all along, or is it somehow the change is occurring in the reflection and the reconception? Yeah, this is a sort of tricky one that I want to be able to articulate better, but I'm not going to stop here. Yeah, so a question was asked, yeah, does that mean that it was never anger? Are we just defining it as something else? Or that we like misunderstood what it was? I don't know. Akira says, and this is from Gendlin, that what we are feeling, he gets to this later in the paper, is implicit. What we are feeling is raw experience. It's not yet in words. It's not yet been conceptualized. So it's pre-conceptual. It's predefined. I'm just noticing I can see a way in which I can like unpack this a lot based on other things I've read, but I think I'm not gonna try to do that right now. Just that, yeah, there's this core distinction between raw experience and the way in which we conceptualize raw experience. There's the bodily experience, the direct experience, the somatic experience of whatever, like your heart beating faster and like heat in your body and this like impulse to like punch somebody or whatever, or like speak loudly. And you can notice all of that happening without naming any of it necessarily, and certainly without naming any of it or all of it together as anger. But then once you do, you've conceptualized it, right? So there's the raw experience on one hand, and then there's the conceptualization of that raw experience. And the conceptualization is something different than the raw experience. The raw experience itself is not the concept. The concept is a name and a label that we put onto the raw experience that helps us understand what it was. But it's not, there's not an equation between the two. Yeah, someone asked, is the change in definition itself the change? So if we say, we thought it was anger all along, and now it seems to us that we were lonely, are we redefining it? And is that redefinition process itself what's making the change in personality? I had this question about anxiety. I don't know. I kind of felt like the reason why I asked it was sort of because I was misreading things. Because Gendlin says, where is it? Like, intolerably anxious here. So, in the repression paradigm, which he talks about, that we grow up and we are taught by our society and our family, etc., that like certain things are not okay, and so we repress those things, and so then those things get out of sight, and so they go into the unconscious, right? And in psychoanalytic theory, there's all sort of mechanisms described about the way in which that stuff is kept out of sight and repressed from conscious awareness. But yeah, that there's this idea within that theory that if that stuff were to arise, if you were to become aware of that stuff which is repressed, then the person would become intolerably anxious. And what was it that I was asking about exactly? I was asking about the significance of the anxious, because he just says that. And he gives other examples later, kind of quoting, from other major theories about what happens when this unconscious repressed material becomes conscious. So there's this, for example, quote like, the ego will lose control, or the self will disintegrate, etc. And I was curious about anxious because he talks about anxiety in an earlier paper. As distinct from fear, specifically. Yeah, I don't know. I think this is still sort of a fuzzy area for me. I don't think I got a good answer, but yeah, it's tricky for me that Gendlin distinguishes between anxiety and fear. maybe, I don't know where I'm getting this from. I presume it's from Gendlin himself, but I'm sure I've actually read it from other people. But that anxiety has no uh, like direct object. It has no source. It's not about or caused by anything that we can specifically point to, whereas fear does, right? Like you can be afraid of a bear uh, that's in front of you, but anxiety is just this sort of general unease and fear, but which you can't give any reason for. It's not about or caused by anything that you're able to specify. Um, so again, I don't know, but explaining it that way, conceiving it of that way, makes it weird in this case because he's saying that the intolerable anxiety would arise from recognizing the the stuff that was repressed. So I don't know. That's open question area for me. Um, Akira then said, "Yeah, so Freud and Carl Rogers, as different as they were, as different as their theories were, had a similar way of thinking. And they both have this idea that there's a filter somehow that controls what can come into a person's awareness. And that the fact of there being this filter, however explained, means that theoretically, that stuff which is sort of filtered out, or that stuff which is always misconstrued because of the filter, can never be seen clearly. It's always going to be misconstrued. It's always going to be kept repressed. There is no way within those theories to explain how something which is always misconstrued, always misinterpreted, always repressed, there's no way to explain how that stuff can actually come into awareness and be like genuinely acknowledged without that filter springing into action. I was wondering, yeah, is anxiety a feeling? I think this was something I was remembering from a different paper and misunderstanding. I think I think well, I think he would say, because of what specifically it was. This might be just complicating and muddying the waters, but I was thinking of this line in particular from the process concept of relationship paper. Yeah, where he makes a distinction about a feeling that does not move into expressive action is not a feeling at all. It is a potential feeling that is not experienced in itself, which is kind of complicated. And it's a different paper, so I don't want to dig too much into this. But yeah, I think this was why I asked the question, because I was like, is anxiety, is anxiety a feeling, or is it a potential feeling? And it's here that, he says anxiety and tension as separate things. So, I don't know. Anyway, that's another open question. Someone asked something, this was my own paraphrase, which makes the answer seem obvious. But yeah, does the difference and change in cultural values over time, from the 60s, let's say, to today, uh, do those cultural values change what and how much gets repressed? Like, so to grow up in a family in the 60s and the kinds of things that were socially acceptable and whatever, versus today, lead to different kinds of things uh, being rejected and repressed. For example, like in the 60s and before, men crying was like not a common thing, kind of not an okay thing, not an acceptable thing, really. Um, Whereas nowadays it's much more welcome. Not to say that everyone's gotten there yet, but it's much more welcome. So, if you cried as a male child in the 60s, you might be met with, some kind of stern response in a way that a male child nowadays would not be. Um, this was just a quote from the paper that I like. Change happens, but to say that is not to offer an explanation. It is only to state the problem. Okay, so yeah, then there's another question asking, is the awareness of that stuff that has been repressed, or is the becoming aware of that stuff, is that itself the change? And the distinction there is important because he distinctly says, and it's said all the time even today, that like simply knowing what's wrong doesn't change anything. That's the sort of classic thing about therapy, and especially talk therapy, that gets pooped on all the time nowadays, right? Which is you can just talk about your narrative, your story, or whatever, and you can understand, you know, you can understand that, let's say, uh, you have insecure attachment, or whatever, but just knowing that doesn't change that fact. Knowledge is not the same as transformation. So that's also an open question. Um, so then Akira mentions, it's like, well, in practice, we do actually become aware of things that previously we weren't aware of. So we have to reformulate what we mean by repressed. Um, which is, again, just to say that if repression means that that which is repressed cannot ever see the light of day because of the sort of psychological mechanisms at play, then there is no way that that stuff can ever become aware to consciousness. But it does. And people do change, and we change. And we realize things that we didn't realize before. Things come to the surface. So, insofar as that is like concretely true, phenomenologically true, we have to reconceive and reformulate what we mean by repressed. This was an interesting note because I've actually studied transactional analysis a bit, or a model based on transactional analysis. Pia Mellody, who was one of the main writers about codependence, a lot of her work is based on transactional analysis and the framework of like child, teen, or critical adult and adult, or critical parent and adult. And so that's, you think of yourself as having like a child or wounded child in you, or you think of yourself as having a critical parent in you. And you can do that kind of reflection, and you can do that kind of analysis and interpretation and say, yeah, I have this critical parent in me. But then what? How do you explain change? How do you pursue change? How do you make change happen or create the conditions for change to happen once you know that? It's all well and good to know that or to think of it that way, but then what? And I like the chemistry example in here. I'm just gonna read it directly. So this is a whole kind of fat paragraph, but here's the starting quote. Thus, for example, chemistry defines the elements in terms of more basic activities of electrons and protons, and thereby we can account for the subatomic processes by which elements engage in chemical change reactions, and through which an element can be bombarded with subatomic particles and turned into a different element. Without these concepts, which view elements as motions of something more basic, we could not explain the chemical and atomic change we observe, nor operationally study and define the contents under which it occurs. We could state only that at time 1, the test tube had certain contents A and B, while at time 2, the contents were C and D. So only if A, B, C, and D are not themselves the ultimate explanatory concepts can we expect to explain changes from one to another. And so it is with personality change. If our ultimate explanatory constructs are contents, we cannot explain the change in the nature of just these contents, right? So, end quote. So if A, B, C, and D are things which, right, like that's the lowest level, like those are the foundational units of chemistry. If they cannot be broken down further, then how is it that they can ever become something else? How is it that when you combine them and when you do some stuff to them, that you can start with A and B and end up with something else? If A and B is the foundational unit of things that cannot be changed, then how is it that you do actually see change? So that's what Gendlin's saying for psychological theories. That so far, theory has kind of operated in this way where these content ideas of personality are treated as foundational, but insofar as they're foundational, it means that the things of which we are made up theoretically cannot change into something else, but we do experience that change occurs. So what do you do with that? How do you make sense of that? Okay, so then also I was just like, it was pretty cool how many people were on the call, like 80 people. Because this is a deep cut. This is a deep cut paper, so I don't think I was expecting so many people. But something else he talks about, so then he goes and no, he's not talking about a footnote there, but basically he switched from talking about these two paradigms, the repression paradigm and the content paradigm, which are two paradigms which make it theoretically impossible to explain change. And then he goes and switches to noting two universal observations. So observations which are made within all different modalities and theories of psychology. And so what Akira was pointing out, that here is really where Gendlin starts to bring in phenomenological method. And I think I've heard this before, but you know, I think this is also something that within certain groups and scenes, bracketing is something that is a term that's used, but it's a phenomenological method where you say, okay, the existing sort of like conceptual frameworks and theories don't allow me to make sense of this thing that I actually do observe. So let me just bracket the theory. Let me just put that sort of down, put it on the shelf for now, and just deal with the thing that I actually observe and pay more attention to that and think more about this thing. Look more closely at this thing that actually we do witness in reality, and just like leave aside the inadequate theory for now. So that's what Gendlin starts doing here. Is he's like, well, we have these two paradigms which kind of get us stuck. So let's just put that aside and talk about these two observations, which are made in all sort of approaches to therapy and psychology. So there's this note about something experiential is happening that exceeds the person's intellectual understanding. So that's in reference to this first observation, that it always change involves some intense affective or feeling process. So something happens in the person, some concrete experiential thing, some feeling thing happens in the person, which exceeds that person's ability to like understand it and make sense of it and articulate it and explain it. There's some raw experience, some somatic, organismic process occurring that you can feel but cannot grasp intellectually. So there's this big distinction made about merely and really. So that like therapists will talk about, like, is a person merely talking about their problems and merely sort of like rehashing their personal stories, or are they really engaging with it? And if they're merely doing it, if they're merely rehashing things, then like they're just operating on the surface level and nothing's really happening. And if they're really doing therapy, then they're really working through it and they're really having that feeling process go on. And I hear all sorts of people say this kind of stuff today too, so it remains a major distinction. Joe Hudson, for example, talks about this distinction all the time. You really have to feel what comes up. And yet, at the same time, those two terms are super vague, and they don't give any kind of precise articulation of what's actually happening in either case. But I want to jump down to this footnote number 6 because Akira brought it up as one of the few footnotes that he wanted to highlight. So I'm not going to read it out loud, but I have it here. I'm just going to read it myself. Yeah. So basically, yeah, Carl Rogers discovered that, well, Carl Rogers is famous for developing reflective listening, where you just repeat back what you're hearing, either literally in the same words or, you know, repeating back the essential meaning that you're hearing the person expressing. And a lot of the therapy psychology field uh, sort of thought this was dumb and overly simplistic, and there wasn't a theoretical way to understand why this worked or had any value. It seemed, like anyone can do it. And why would that help anyone to just hear back their own words? But yeah, he discovered that when you respond to someone in their own, uh, within their own internal frame of reference, something which is actually in that person's awareness. It's sort of like, like you could tell me whatever, a story about your relationship with your mom, um, or whatever, and um, I could then respond with a sort of interpretation or analysis, which brings in all sorts of concepts that like you don't understand, you know. So it's like I'm the expert here, and I'm telling you what I just heard in what you told me, right? But I'm no longer really referring directly to what you told me or what you're literally experiencing in this moment. For example, like if you're feeling some intense feeling in this moment, I'm not really referring to that anymore. But I'm putting something over the top, like I'm putting the map over the territory. I'm telling you how it is. Um, but by referring directly to a person's own internal frame of reference and what's within their awareness now, it provides a common ground. It's like, no, this thing is really happening right now. You just told me, uh, you just expressed that this is happening concretely for you, and I'm showing you that I also am hearing that I'm seeing that I'm experiencing that with you, and that meeting on the same page allows for a person to then move forward and something new happens, something changes. Um, Whereas if you come in with an analysis, it can very well trigger further defensiveness and resistance. So, anyway, that was that footnote. Um, what is the feeling process and what is the personal relationship? Anyway, it's just asking the question of what are these two observations. Um, uh, yeah, so someone in my breakout group made an interesting point, which I totally relate to and can validate in my own experience, is that as we have studied Eugene Gendlin's work and come to understand his concepts better and his theories, an interesting byproduct of that is that we have become kinder to ourselves. The way in which uh, relate to ourselves, and the way in which we try to understand ourselves becomes gentler and kinder. And that, in and of itself, is a really powerful change. Um, and what I was saying in the group was, yeah, in my own experience, yeah, because I've been studying Gendlin for many years now, and over time, I feel like, yeah, I've become radically more compassionate and gentler and kinder to myself. And it's something that I can notice directly, but it also really crops up and it gets highlighted when I talk to other people and I hear about the way in which people are hard on themselves and are searching for like the reason why they're screwed up in some way, or like what at the bottom is like broken in them or something. um, and um, yeah, like for example, I just recently did a 10-day silent meditation vipassana retreat, and at the end of the 10 days, when we could all start talking to each other again, people were sharing about the kind of hang-ups that they were getting over the course of those 10 days during our sits, and being like, why am I this way, like, oh, I'm so screwed up, and feeling like really self-critical and self-deprecating, and feeling like there's something broken in me, just this general vibe. um, and hearing that, I realized like it's not how it was for me. I didn't feel like it's just not how I was conceiving of myself and relating to myself anymore, that I am screwed up and broken and need to be fixed. Challenging things arose during my sits, absolutely, um, but it wasn't of that nature. So that was really cool, uh, to just think about the way in which just changing the way in which we conceive of ourselves and what it means to be a person, and how psychological change works, and putting aside these other theories, and kind of learning to navigate and see through Gendlin's theory, all by itself sort of allows for change to occur, and allows for us to have a different relationship to ourselves. Instead of trying to change ourselves, we're changing the concepts and theories that we're using to understand ourselves, and that all by itself creates a lot of change in our experience. And then, yeah, another person in my small group was mentioning about, like, in spiritual circles, these tendencies to, you have these ideas of like, what's the meaning of my life, or like, what's my spiritual path, or like, what is my calling, and what is God's plan for me, and right, like all of these ways of conceiving of spiritual life. It sort of, it can very much lock you in to then looking for exactly that kind of thing. You start to look for, what is my purpose, what is God's plan for me, what is my path, like, and then you're looking for that particular thing. And so then you try to sort of like, you understand your entire experience through that framework, and then you get caught up when you can't find it or something, and this person mentioned how, yeah, generally in the West we tend to look for some absolute fundamental truth, some unchanging core, something which does not change. Yeah, so we think everything is a thing. That's kind of a very good, simple way of talking about that tendency within Western philosophy and culture. So we think everything is a thing. Everything is an object. um, everything is made out of bits and units, right? I always think of that classic thing, that saying that is so often used in sort of personal development of, I'm building I'm not just building a wall, I'm laying bricks, or you go up and you see a guy laying bricks and you ask him what's he doing, and he's like, oh, I'm laying bricks. And then you go to another guy who's laying bricks and you ask him what he's doing, and he's like, I'm building a wall. And then there's another guy and you talk to him and he's like, oh, I'm building a cathedral, right? And it's always used, this anecdote is like, yeah, you see the big picture, right? uh, Rather than just focusing on the the minute action that you're doing, um, and how transformative that can be to like recognize the greater meaning and context of what you're doing. But I always think of that because it's fundamentally based on this unit model. It's brick by brick, unit by unit. You're building something out of units. And that same paradigm is so often used to think about ourselves and how we work as human beings. That we ourselves are sort of made brick by brick, and that we're making a cathedral of ourselves. That's a very common way of thinking in personal development. So then there's a question about how, yeah, the types of disorder, like the very like most common types of disorders and issues dealt with in therapy changes over time, decade by decade or whatever. Where in the 60s, as this person mentioned, it was a very lot of neuroticism, and nowadays you deal with BPD and um, like neurodivergence related, like it's neurological, neurodivergence, brain based things, um, ADHD, um, CPTSD. Someone asked just broadly, like, what does therapy give us? Okay, cool, we're reading this paper and um, we're refining our concepts, we're finding better theories, but so what? Like, what does that give us? Um, I guess I don't know that was really answered super well. Maybe it wasn't. I'm just forgetting. But for myself, I think I can speak to this, where part of the reason, one of the big reasons why I discovered Gendlin towards the end of 2018, um, and pretty immediately felt like this guy was really onto something. And every time I would engage with his work, I would want to go further, because I just felt like to really deeply understand and embody and be able to see the world through the theory that he developed would be really transformative, and it would almost be like a superpower, um, that I would just see the world in a radically different way. I would be able to see how things work and how things relate to each other in a totally different way than I could before. Um, and I think that's really proven to be true. And so by having these kind of different concepts, it allows you to see something different than you could see with the different concepts. So I'm trying to think of a simple, concrete example. Um, sort of like, do you see, I mean, yeah, as a simple way of talking about it, it's like, do you see things in isolation, or do you see things in their contexts and with all of their relationships to everything around them, right? So I grew up very much surrounded by ecological thinking, so that's very much kind of baked into my way of looking at things since I was a kid. But ecology is about, it's a systems thinking science where it's not looking at uh, you know let's say the population of wolves in Wyoming in isolation and like analyzing just the wolves. Why is the wolf population ballooning, or why is it decreasing? And just looking at that in isolation without reference to the overall context. But ecology is asking, okay, the wolves exist as part of this much bigger system, and what are all the things that exist within the system, and how do they interact? And how could it be that perhaps the deforestation in this area is impacting the soil quality over here, and then the water in the rivers changes, and then that impacts the deer population, and then that comes back around and impacts the wolf population, right? It's like it's all connected. So you don't just see a wolf by itself, you see wolf as part of this larger system with all this interlinking web of dynamic relationships. Um, you know, um, there's a lot of other examples I could try to find, but I guess I'll leave it at that for now. Um, or, I mean, this is a very personal example for me, or like an example that I use a lot of time and is very personally meaningful, is the idea of being barefoot, and why, for me, that's super important, to be barefoot as much as possible, or to be as close to barefoot as much as possible. And it's like, you could just think about like foot and ground, and like they're just like two objects that touch each other, and like whatever, done deal, story over, right? But for me, to walk around in shoes, let alone to walk around in shoes on flat pavement, it means that all of the sensory experience and all of the neurological uh, activation and information that could be occurring by having your feet touch the actual raw ground is just not there anymore, right? So it's this realization. It's like, look, thinking about my feet as something other than just like a, a piece of meat on the ground, or like it's not just a tire. Like, my feet have like an insane amount of neurological endings. My feet are extremely sensitive. They're full of musculature, and all of my balance starts there. So if I, am standing barefoot on uneven ground or on gravel, like I'm getting so much information about my environment and my relationship to my environment. And then the rest of my body is then also involved in that, in finding the balance, uh, and all of the neurological activation and all the benefits of that is taking place. But if I'm just standing there in shoes, then like I'm not sensing the texture of the ground, or the temperature of the ground, or is it wet or is it dry, right? And so I'm because of that becoming like massively ignorant in a way, about my environment, and I'm being all of that neurological activation is being cut off, and all of the musculature involved in balance is just no longer required anymore. And so that progressively leads to this erosion of the sort of nuances of my musculature and balance throughout my body, and my neural, uh, my brain is what's the word that I'm looking for? It just like goes offline, right? It's not being used. Atrophy. It's atrophying because there's no connection there. But if you don't think about this, the immense amount of subtleties involved, for example, in your foot and its relationship to the ground, and the way in which your foot sends information up through your whole body, and your whole body's system is involved in dealing with the information that you're getting. Like, if you're not thinking about all of that, it's just like, okay, your foot on the ground, like, is my shoe soft or is it not? Is it comfortable? Is it not? Whatever, end of story. So there's just so much that you're not seeing and not thinking about, um, when you see yourself as sort of this mere object, as opposed to this like really complex living system that interacts with its environment. So that's an example that I use all the time, and really is like practically impactful. Like, it changes how I live. It changes where I want to live. It changes the kind of activities that I want to engage in and how I engage in those activities. And it becomes a metaphor as well for me to think about how I engage with my life and the world in general, you know? So it's a very powerful thing. Um, so yeah, that's, I think these other notes, this was kind of my question at the end, was how is it that using these new concepts and bracketing these old theories allows us ultimately to be kinder to ourselves? And I think it's what I'm saying about the barefoot thing. In my work, I always tell people, the way in which we are investigating you, right, to my client, like the way in which we're investigating your experience here is not from this point of view of saying, there's these contradictory things about you that you need to like fix this thing over here in order to bring it in line with the rest of you, or you know my view is what I say specifically is that all aspects of our experience, our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, our emotions, our physical experience, our somatic experience, all of these things, they are all emergent phenomena of a complex nonlinear system. And if right now those phenomena seem to contradict each other, if it seems that this thing over here is out of alignment with this thing over here, it's not because they fundamentally are. It just means that we haven't looked close enough at where they're coming from, because they're coming out of the system. And so for me, that's really an impactful way of looking at it, because it's no longer about saying like, okay, here's all these ways in which you're screwed up and out of alignment, and ways in which we need to like tweak things. There's, it becomes a question of, no, like, let's just look more closely Let's get really precise and look at the subtleties of your experience. Because when we look really close, and also when we zoom out and see you in a broader context, then you realize that kind of everything does make sense. Like, you are handling this situation in the way that you are in a totally sensible, reasonable way, given the overall situation, given your history, given all of your experiences and how you've made sense of them, given your worldview, etc. Right? And so it's not actually that you're screwed up and made up of all these incompatible things. It's just that so far you haven't been able to see in the context within which they all exist, or the way the the the, the organismic system out of which those things are all emerging. So that's how I usually sort of set up all my calls with people, um, because it allows you to sort of do away with this idea that there's some kind of fundamentally brokenness that we need to fix. And it's just like, oh, well, what's there and what's the context? Um, I fundamentally believe and have faith that it makes sense. We just don't know how to make sense of it yet. So let's look. And that by itself is like a radically more gentle, curious, and kinder way of reflecting and dealing with and relating with our own selves and our own experience. So, yeah, that's all my notes for today's session. I think I'll end it here. I've been recording for quite a while, almost 2 hours, I think. Um, so, yeah, I will end it.